An 18-year-old was rejected for being obese, until a lonely giant Apache took her in. The church bell rang in the cold. Townfolk laughed as the young woman stood alone, cheeks burning from shame. Then hooves on the frozen street. A towering Apache dismounted, draped his blanket over her shoulders, and led her away before anyone could speak. Whispers turned to gossip. Why would a man like him bring home a girl like her? In a cabin by the frozen river, she found warmth, respect, and a secret that could cost them everything. The railroad was coming for his land and the sacred springs beneath it. They had 3 weeks to prove they were family, or lose it forever. Deputies rattled their keys, ready to lock him away. Now with the town against them and time running out, one choice could save his home or destroy them both. Will she walk away to save herself, or stand by him and risk everything? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. Hannah's heart thundered in her chest as Nanton helped her onto his horse. The wool blanket he draped around her shoulders carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, wrapping her in unexpected comfort. Behind them, the buzz of shocked whispers from the churchyard faded into the crisp February air. "Hold tight," Nanton said quietly, swinging up behind her with fluid grace. His deep voice carried no judgment, only gentle concern. The horses' hooves crunched against the frozen ground as they started down the San Juan River Road. Hannah sat stiffly at first, painfully aware of her size and how the saddle creaked beneath their combined weight. But Nanton's steady presence at her back and his sure handling of the reins slowly eased her tension. "I am sorry they were cruel," he said after they'd ridden a ways. "Some men mistake meanness for strength." Hannah's throat tightened. The memory of those 3 bachelors, their sideways glances, their poorly hidden smirks burned fresh in her mind, especially that last one with his cutting words about draft horses. She'd stood there forcing a smile while laughter rippled through the crowd, feeling like a spectacle. "You didn't have to rescue me," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone will talk. Let them talk." The simple statement held no hesitation. "I saw a woman being treated without honor. That is not our way." A gust of wind swept down from the mesas, carrying the bite of winter. Hannah pulled the blanket tighter, grateful for its warmth. "Your way. Apache way," he explained. "We believe every person carries medicine gifts given by Creator. To mock another is to mock Creator's wisdom." His words settled deep in Hannah's chest, soothing hurts she'd carried so long she'd almost forgotten they were there. Since her parents' death 10 years ago, she'd lived with her aunt's constant reminders about her size, her appetite, her unlikely prospects for marriage. The criticism had become as familiar as her own reflection. The horse's steady gait carried them past scattered homesteads and winter-brown fields. A red-tailed hawk wheeled overhead, its cry piercing the afternoon quiet. Hannah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, her back warming where it pressed against Nanton's chest. "I know the spring's near here," he said after a while. "Clean water, good shade. Would you like to rest?" Hannah hesitated. The proper thing would be to ask him to take her straight home. But the thought of facing her aunt's questions and likely criticism made her stomach clench. "Yes," she said softly, "I would like that." Nanton guided them off the main road onto a narrow trail. The path wound through stands of juniper and pinyon pine before opening onto a small clearing. A spring bubbled up from between rocks, its water catching the winter sunlight. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands were strong and sure on her waist, showing no strain at her weight. When her feet touched ground, Hannah stumbled slightly on legs gone numb from riding. Nanton steadied her with gentle hands. "Careful," he said. "Sit here." He indicated a sun-warmed boulder near the spring. Hannah settled onto the rock, arranging her skirts and the blanket around her. Nanton moved to tend his horse, removing the flour sacks and letting the animal drink from the spring. His movements were unhurried, peaceful. The quiet between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. "This is a sacred place to my people," he said finally, joining her on the boulder. "The waters here have brought healing for many generations." Hannah watched the spring's clear flow, mesmerized by the way it caught the light. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Yes." His dark eyes held a depth of meaning she couldn't quite read. Like many beautiful things, it is threatened. The railroad wants this land. They say the water rights belong to them now. But that's not right, Hannah protested. Your people have been here for generations. Nanton's smile held a mixture of warmth and sadness. You understand more than most, Hannah Cole. He spoke her name with careful respect. But understanding is not enough. The railroad has papers, lawyers. We have only our words and our memories. Hannah twisted her hands in her lap, wishing she could help somehow. The injustice of it echoed her own smaller hurts, the feeling of being judged and found wanting by those who claimed authority. Tell me, Nanton said suddenly, what brings you joy? The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure anyone's asked me that before, she thought for a moment. I love to cook. To take simple things and make them into something that brings comfort to others. My mother taught me, before she passed. Nanton nodded. That is good medicine. The ability to nourish others is sacred work. Most folks just see it as women's work, Hannah said softly. Nothing special. Those who think so have forgotten how. To see truly, he gestured to the spring. Like this water simple, but life-giving. What matters is not how others value the gift, but how faithfully we use it. Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the quiet wisdom in his words. For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in years, she felt truly seen. The winter sun had begun its descent toward the western mesas, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks. Soon they would need to head back. But for now, Hannah sat in peaceful silence beside this unexpected friend, watching the play of light on water and feeling her heart grow lighter with each passing moment. Thank you, she said finally. Not just for the rescue, but for showing me this place. For treating me like a person worth knowing. Nanton's eyes met hers, warm and sincere. You have always been worth knowing, Hannah Cole. Some people's vision is too clouded by their own fears to see clearly. But I see you. The big bay horse picked its way carefully along Salt Creek's main street, hooves crunching on patches of ice between the frozen ruts. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the horses. Maine, feeling the weight of stares from every window and doorway they passed. The wool blanket around her shoulders offered little shield against the whispers that followed their progress. At the smithy, old Mr. Peterson stopped his hammering to gawk. Outside the mercantile, Mrs. Whitaker and her daughters huddled together, their heads bent close in furious conversation. Hannah's cheeks burned, but she refused to look up. The steady warmth of Nanton at her back and his sure handling of the reins gave her courage to keep going. They rode in silence until they crested the ridge that marked the edge of town. As Salt Creek disappeared behind them, Hannah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The winter landscape stretched out before them, rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon, all dusted with patches of snow. In the distance, the San Juan River wound like a silver ribbon through the valley. Where? Hannah's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. Where are we going? My cabin, Nanton replied. Near the river. He adjusted, his grip on the reins, guiding the horse around a patch of ice. You can cook and mend there in exchange for food and warm bed. No other bargain. The simple offer, stated without demand or expectation, brought unexpected tears to Hannah's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, grateful he couldn't see her face. That's very kind, she managed. Not kindness. Fair trade. His deep voice held a note of respect that made her sit a little straighter. I have seen your cooking at church suppers. You have skill. They rode on as the winter sun tracked across the sky. Hannah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. The familiar ache of others' judgment began to ease, replaced by curiosity about what lay ahead. By late afternoon, they approached a modest cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near the San Juan's banks. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, dancing against the pale sky. As they drew closer, Hannah saw a tall figure by a woodpile, an axe flashing in the slanted sunlight. The man straightened as they approached, revealing a broad smile beneath his dark mustache. Unlike Nanton's quiet intensity, this man's whole bearing spoke of good humor. Cousin, he called out in English, striding toward them. I was starting to think you'd frozen solid in town. His eyes moved to Hannah with frank curiosity, but no judgment. No judgment. Taza, Nanton said as he dismounted, this is Hannah Cole. He helped Hannah down from the horse, his hand steady and respectful at her waist. "Hannah, my cousin Taza." "Welcome," Taza said, giving a small bow that somehow managed to be both playful and sincere. "I just finished chopping wood." Good timing. The temperature's dropping fast. Hannah couldn't help but warm to his friendly manner. "Thank you," she said softly. "I hope I won't be too much trouble." "Trouble?" Taza grinned. "After eating nothing but my cousin's cooking all winter, you're a blessing straight from heaven." Nanton said something in Apache that made Taza laugh, though his eyes held a warning. He led Hannah toward the cabin while Taza took care of the horse. Inside, Hannah found herself in a neat, well-ordered space. A solid table with 2 chairs stood near the window, a small iron stove occupied one corner, and everything was swept clean. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their subtle fragrance mixing with wood smoke. It wasn't large, but it felt peaceful. "You can put your things there," Nanton indicated a small trunk near the wall. "Are you hungry?" Hannah nodded, already eyeing the stove with professional interest. "I could help prepare supper," she offered. "I saw you had flour in those sacks." "There are dried beans," Nanton said. "And cornmeal." "Cornbread would go well with beans," Hannah said, her confidence growing as she moved into familiar territory. "If you'd like?" A ghost of a smile touched Nanton's lips. "Very much." The next hour passed in comfortable activity. Hannah mixed cornbread, while Nanton tended the beans that had been simmering all day. Taza came in with more firewood, filling the small space with cheerful chatter about the weather and local news. The domesticity of it all began to ease Hannah's earlier distressed as they sat down to eat. Hannah noticed the men exchange a look before Nanton spoke a few quiet words in Apache. Taza responded, his usual smile dimming slightly, though they kept their voices low. Hannah caught her own name in the exchange. The food was simple but satisfying. Hannah had added sage to the cornbread, remembering the scent from the blanket earlier. Both men praised her cooking with obvious sincerity, making her flush with pleasure. Later, as Taza cleared the dishes, Hannah heard Nanton say quietly in English, "We must have family here before spring or we lose the land." The words settled heavily in her chest, pieces clicking into place. Their kindness wasn't just kindness. They needed her presence here for some larger purpose. The realization should have hurt, should have felt like another rejection, but somehow it didn't. Whatever their reasons, they had treated her with more dignity in one afternoon than she'd known in years. She looked down at her hands, calloused from cooking and mending, and thought about Nanton's words at the spring, about gifts and how they're used. Maybe there was purpose in being needed, even if the needing came sideways and unexpected. Hannah woke to the sharp bite of cold air on her nose, the only part of her that peeked out from beneath the thick quilts. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, carrying with it the promising aroma of coffee. Outside, boot heels scraped against wooden planks, followed by the sound of quiet conversation. She dressed quickly in the chill, grateful for the warmth of her wool stockings. When she emerged from behind the blanket Nanton had hung as a privacy screen, she found a cup of coffee waiting on the table, steam rising in delicate curls. "Good morning," Nanton said from his place by the stove. He held out a handful of shirts, their cuffs worn thin and fraying. "Can you sew?" Hannah nodded, taking a grateful sip of the coffee before examining the shirts. "Yes, I can mend these." The fabric was sturdy despite its wear, worth saving. "Do you have thread and needles?" Taza produced a small wooden box from a shelf. "Ma's sewing kit," he explained. "Been waiting for someone who knows what to do with it." The morning settled into a quiet rhythm. Hannah set up her work near the window where the light was best, sorting through the shirts and planning her repairs. Nanton and Taza headed out to check their trap lines, their breath visible in the cold air as they discussed their route. The familiar task of mending brought Hannah a sense of peace. Her needle dipped and pulled through the fabric, creating neat, even stitches that would hold fast. She hummed softly as she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her rising unbidden to her lips. By midday, her fingers needed a break from the close work. The sun had risen high and bright, tempting her to venture outside despite the cold. Hannah wrapped Nanton's wool blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The sight took her breath away. The San Juan River stretched before her, its surface a glittering expanse of ice and open water that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Steam rose from patches where the water remained unfrozen, creating ghostly shapes that danced in the winter air. The springs keep parts from freezing. Nanton's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him and Taza returning, a field-dressed deer slung between them, even in the coldest weather. They carried the deer to the side of the cabin where a work area was set up. Hannah watched as they began the practiced work of breaking down the carcass, their movements efficient and respectful. "The water here is sacred," Nanton continued as he worked, his hand sure and steady with the knife. "It has sustained my people since before anyone can remember. Now the railroad men want it. Want it?" Hannah asked, drawing the blanket closer. Against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "For their steam engines," Taza explained, his usually cheerful face serious. "Year-round water source never fails. They've been trying to force us off since they surveyed the route." Hannah watched as they finished their work, wrapping portions of meat to be smoked or stored. She thought about the springs bubbling up from the earth, faithful through every season, and the generations who had drunk from them. Something in her chest tightened at the thought of all this being lost to the screech and smoke of locomotives. The short winter day faded quickly. After supper, while Taza cleaned up, Nanton sat by the stove and motioned for Hannah to join him. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face as he spoke. "The army came last month," he said quietly. "They say if we cannot prove this is a proper household by spring, the land goes to the railroad." His hands, still red from the cold, opened and closed slowly. "They do not see this as a home without family living here. Just 2 men, they say, is not enough." Understanding dawned like a physical weight in Hannah's chest. Her presence here wasn't just about cooking and mending. She was already part of their proof. A woman's presence making their cabin a proper household in the Army's eyes. She should have felt used, perhaps, or trapped. Instead, she felt an unexpected surge of purpose. Here was a way to be truly needed, to help protect something precious. Yet unease flickered at the edges of her gratitude. What would the town say when they learned? What would it mean for her to be part of this? The evening settled around them like a heavy blanket. As Hannah prepared for bed behind her screen, she found herself humming again, Amazing Grace, her mother's favorite. The familiar melody filled the quiet cabin, mixing with the pop and crackle of the stove. When she finished, she peeked around the screen. Nanton sat in his chair, eyes half closed, firelight playing across his still features. For a moment, she thought he had fallen asleep, but then he spoke softly. "Your mother taught you that song?" "Yes," Hannah replied, surprised. "She sang it every evening when I was small." Nanton nodded slowly, eyes still on the fire. "My mother also sang to me," he said. "Different songs, same love." The simple words hung in the air between them, building an unexpected bridge across their differences. Hannah slipped beneath her quilts, the warmth of understanding wrapping around her more securely than any blanket. 2 days passed like water flowing over river stones, each hour bringing Hannah deeper into the rhythm of cabin life. On the morning of the 3rd day, she stood in the kitchen area, studying the neat shelves where Nanton kept his supplies. Her fingers tapped thoughtfully against her apron as she considered the stores. "I want to do more," she announced when Nanton came in from feeding his horse. "Show me where everything is. I can't contribute properly if I don't know what we have to work with." A ghost of a smile touched Nanton's lips as he nodded. He moved to the shelves, pointing out each item in turn. "Flour here, traded for it. Last month. Dried beans from summer's harvest." His hand moved to a higher shelf. Smoked venison, dried corn, salt. Hannah took mental inventory, already planning meals. Her eyes lit up when she spotted a small cloth bag. "Are those juniper berries?" "Yes. Good for medicine, good for food." Nanton paused, then added quietly, "My favorite, when cooked right." "Then I'll make something special," Hannah said, reaching for the flour. Her hands knew the motions without thought, measuring, mixing, kneading. Soon the smell of baking biscuits filled the cabin, making even Taza poke his head in from his wood chopping. While the biscuits baked, Hannah started a stew, adding the juniper berries with careful consideration. The rich aroma of meat and herbs slowly filled the small space. When Nanton returned from checking his trap lines, he paused in the doorway, breathing deeply. "Smells like my mother's cooking," he said softly. Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. She'd seen how carefully he portioned their supplies. His words told her she'd earned his trust with them. After the midday meal, during which Nanton had taken seconds of the stew, he suggested they check the river ice. "Need to know if it's thick enough for hauling water," he explained, holding the door for her. They walked side by side down the worn path to the riverbank. The afternoon sun had some warmth in it now, though the air remained crisp. Hannah watched as Nanton tested the ice with a long pole, showing her where it was safe to step and where the springs kept the water too warm for freezing. "Come spring," he said, gesturing to a flat area near the bank. "Good soil here. Beans grow well, corn too, squash." He pointed to different spots as he spoke. Medicine plants along the edges where the water seeps up. Hannah could see it in her mind. Green shoots pushing through dark earth, the promise of food and healing rising from the ground. She was about to ask about planting time when hoofbeats approached from the north trail. Mrs. Sarah Hartley rode into view on her dappled mare, her silver-streaked hair neat under her bonnet despite the winter wind. Hannah knew her by sight from church, a widow who ran her small ranch alone since losing her husband to a cattle stampede 3 years back. "Afternoon, Nanton," Mrs. Hartley called, then turned a warm smile to Hannah. "Miss Cole. What a pleasant. Surprised to see you out here." They spoke for a few minutes about the weather and the state of the trails. Mrs. Hartley mentioned having eggs to trade, and Nanton offered smoked venison in return. The older woman's manner was friendly, but Hannah noticed her sharp eyes taking in every detail. As Hannah moved away to examine a patch of dried herbs Nanton had pointed out earlier, she heard Mrs. Hartley's voice drop low. "Are you certain about taking in a white girl, Nanton? The town's already talking." Hannah busied herself with the herbs, pretending she hadn't heard, but her cheeks burned. She'd known there would be talk, of course. There was always talk in Salt Creek. Nanton's reply came clear and firm. "Hannah is welcome here. The town's talk is their business, not mine." The conversation turned back to trade arrangements, and soon Mrs. Hartley was riding away with a package of venison tied to her saddle. Hannah kept her eyes on the river until she was sure her face had cooled. That evening, after supper, Hannah sat by the stove darning socks while Nanton cleaned his rifle. The quiet between them felt comfortable now, like a well-worn blanket. She found herself thinking about the river, how it kept flowing under the ice, steady and strong. "What is the Apache word for river?" she asked suddenly. Nanton looked up from his work. "T," he said carefully. "T," Hannah repeated, trying to match his pronunciation. He shook his head slightly. "T," he said again, emphasizing the tone. She tried several more times until finally he nodded in approval. The simple word felt right in her mouth, like it belonged there. Like she belonged here, in this cabin by the river that never stopped. Flowing, no matter how cold the world grew around it. By week's end, the crisp mountain air carried the soft whisper of falling snow. Tiny flakes drifted down like scattered feathers, dusting the frozen ground in white. Hannah stood at the cabin window, watching the gentle snowfall transform the landscape into something that looked almost magical. "Need more wood before it gets deeper," Nanton said from behind her. "The mule can pull the sled while the snow's still light." Hannah nodded, already reaching for her shawl and the thick woolen mittens she'd mended the day before. Outside, the air held that special stillness that came with snow, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the mule's snorts of protest as Nanton hitched him to the wooden sled. They set off toward a stand of cottonwoods that lined the river. About a mile upstream, Hannah walked beside the sled while Nanton led the mule, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The sled's runners creaked rhythmically against the snow-dusted ground. "The cottonwoods are good for burning," Nanton explained as they reached the grove. "Dead branches fall often. Saves the work of cutting living trees." Together they gathered fallen wood, loading the sled carefully. Hannah found she enjoyed the steady work, despite the cold seeping through her boots. The physical labor kept her warm, and there was something satisfying about preparing for the deeper winter ahead. The return journey proved more challenging. The snow fell faster now, and the loaded sled moved slowly, its runners protesting against the added weight. About halfway back, they came to a shallow drift that had built up across their path. The mule planted his feet and refused to move forward. "Come on, you stubborn thing," Hannah coaxed, trying not to laugh at the animal's distinctly unimpressed expression. She moved to the mule's head, speaking softly. "It's not that deep. You can do it." The mule flicked his ears and stayed put. Nanton clicked his tongue and gave a gentle tug on the lid rope. Still no movement. Finally, Hannah couldn't hold back her laughter. "He's as stubborn as my aunt's old cat. Remember how you got past that fallen log yesterday?" she asked the mule. "This is easier than that." Nanton's eyes crinkled at the corners as he watched her talk to the animal. After another minute of gentle coaxing and Hannah's continued amusement at the mule's stubbornness, the creature finally deigned to move forward, stepping through the drift with exaggerated care. By the time they reached the cabin, Hannah's toes felt like ice despite her thick wool stockings. She hurried inside, making straight for the warmth of the cookstove. Her cold reddened hands tingled as she held them near the heat. Looking around the familiar space, the neat shelves she'd organized, the darned curtain in the window, the stack of mended shirts folded on the table, Hannah realized with a start that she felt almost at home here. The thought should have startled her more than it did. The peaceful afternoon shattered when Taza burst through the door just before supper time, bringing with him a gust of snow and troubling news from the agency. "Railroad man coming," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Agent says he'll be surveying near the springs next week." Hannah saw Nanton's jaw tighten, the muscles working beneath his skin. His hands, usually so steady, clenched into fists at his sides. The springs were more than just water to him. They were his heritage, his family's sacred place. "I should go," Hannah said quietly, looking between the cousins. "If having me here makes trouble with the authorities. "No," Nanton's voice was firm. He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "If you go, they win. That's what they want, to say we can't make a real home here." Taza nodded in agreement. "Better to stand together," he said, his usual smile replaced by determination. Later that night, after the men had gone to check the livestock one final time, Hannah knelt beside her narrow bed. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane, but inside the cabin was warm and solid. She clasped her hands and bowed her head, praying quietly for strength. Strength for herself, for Nanton and Taza, for whatever challenges lay ahead. As she prayed, Hannah realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to leave. Not just because leaving would help the railroad's cause, but because this place, these people, had become important to her. The thought of returning to Salt Creek, to the whispers and judgment, made her heart ache. She touched the rough wooden wall beside her bed, feeling the solid reality of it beneath her fingers. Outside, the wind continued its wild song, but here, in this small cabin by the sacred springs, Hannah had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a place where she truly wanted to stay. A week of anxious waiting brought clearer skies but deeper cold. Nanton announced at breakfast they needed supplies from Salt Creek. Hannah's stomach tightened at the thought of returning, but she nodded, knowing they couldn't avoid town forever. "The flour's getting low," she said, trying to sound practical, rather than nervous, "and we need more coffee." The morning sun cast long shadows as they set out, frost crackling under the horses' hooves. Hannah wore her warmest dress and the wool blanket Nanton had given her that first day. The familiar weight of it around her shoulders gave her courage. The ride took several hours. Nanton kept his bay horse at an easy pace beside Hannah's smaller mare. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable. Hannah watched her breath cloud in the bitter air and tried not to think about what awaited them in town. Salt Creek looked unchanged, the same dusty main street, the same weathered buildings, yet everything felt different to Hannah now. As they rode past the church where she'd faced humiliation just weeks ago, she sat straighter in her saddle. The sidewalks weren't crowded, but those few townspeople out on such a cold day stopped to stare. Hannah heard whispers follow them down the street. She kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned. They dismounted outside the mercantile. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and Mr. Graves looked up from his ledger. His usual greeting died on his lips when he saw them together. "Need supplies," Nanton said simply, setting a list on the counter. Hannah had written it in her neat hand that morning. Mr. Graves read through it slowly, too slowly. His eyes darted between them. "That's quite a lot," he said finally. "We can pay," Nanton replied, his voice level. He pulled out a leather pouch. Mr. Graves hesitated when Nanton placed coins on the counter. He picked one up, turned it over as if checking it was real. Hannah's hands clenched at her sides. "The money's good, Mr. Graves," she said quietly but firmly. "Same as anyone else's." The storekeeper's face reddened, but he began gathering their supplies. Hannah helped, knowing where things were stored from years of shopping here with her aunt. She tried to ignore how Mr. Graves watched their every move. They were loading the last items into their saddlebags outside when Hannah heard a familiar voice. Hannah Elizabeth Cole. She turned to see her aunt, Mrs. Webb, hurrying across the street. The older woman's face was a mask of shock and disapproval. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" And with ... Mrs. Webb's eyes flicked to Nanton, then away quickly. Hannah straightened her spine. "I'm working for Mr. Lobo, Aunt Margaret. Cooking and mending, helping around his cabin. Working for him?" Mrs. Webb's voice rose. "Living under his roof?" "Have. You lost your senses completely?" "He's been nothing but kind to me," Hannah said. She felt Nanton's solid presence behind her, giving her strength. Mrs. Webb grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her a few steps away. "You'll ruin any chance you have for a proper match," she hissed. "What decent man will want you after this? Come home with me now, before it's too late." Hannah gently but firmly removed her aunt's hand. "I made my choice," she said. "I'm not coming back." "Then on your head be it," Mrs. Webb snapped. She turned and strode away, her skirt swishing angrily. The ride home started in silence. The sun was past its peak, and the air grew sharper with approaching evening. Hannah's thoughts churned with her aunt's words, though she tried to push them aside. They were halfway home when Nanton spoke. "Do you regret it?" Hannah looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd offered her dignity when others had only mockery, who trusted her to help protect his home. "Not yet," she said softly. She meant it. That evening, after they'd stored the supplies and eaten a simple supper of beans and fresh bread, Nanton stayed at the table instead of heading out to check the stock. He seemed lost in thought, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "My mother," he said finally. "She taught me to read English." Hannah set aside her mending, sensing this was important. She said words on paper could be weapons or shields. Sighed, "I needed both to keep our land." His voice grew quiet. She watched other families lose their places. Saw how men with papers could steal more than army with guns. "Is that why you learned the law?" Hannah asked. She'd seen his careful study of land documents, noticed how he saved every paper from the Indian Agency. Nanton nodded. "Mother was right. They try many ways to take what's ours. First with force, then with rules we're supposed to follow, but they don't." His hands tightened around the cup. "Each time we meet their rules, they make new ones." Hannah thought about the railroad survey, about her aunt's disapproval, about all the subtle ways people tried to push Nanton from his land. She understood better now why he'd brought her here, not just for cooking and mending, but as living proof he could meet their rules for proper household occupation. "Your mother sounds very wise," she said. She was. Pride and old grief mingled in his voice. "Taught me English, taught me to fight with both brain and heart." He looked at Hannah across the table. "Taught me to recognize good people too." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. She picked up her mending again, but her fingers moved slowly, her mind full of all Nanton had shared. She thought about how much he'd already fought to keep this place and how much fight might still lie ahead. Outside, the wind whistled through bare branches, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. But inside the cabin, in the lamplight's warm circle, Hannah felt more certain than ever that she'd made the right choice. The late February sun climbed a bit higher each day, though winter's grip remained firm on the land. Hannah noticed the changing light as she worked, how it lingered longer in the evenings, how it caught the frost in diamond sparkles across the fence posts each morning. One clear morning, Nanton asked her to help repair the fence line near the eastern bluff. Hannah pulled on her warmest coat and followed him out, carrying a bundle of tools while he shouldered several fresh-cut posts. "Wires coming loose here," he explained, pointing to a sagging section. "Animals could push through when snow melts." They worked steadily through the morning. Hannah held the posts straight, while Nanton tamped earth around their bases. Her fingers grew numb despite her wool mittens, but she didn't complain. There was satisfaction in the work, in seeing each section grow stronger, in knowing they were protecting the land together. The sun reached its peak, warming them slightly. Nanton straightened from securing a wire and gestured toward the ground nearby. "Look there," he said quietly. Hannah followed his pointing finger to see delicate impressions in a patch of snow. "Tracks?" "Deer, young one, from the size." Nanton knelt beside the marks. "See how the front is deeper?" It was moving slow, probably browsing. He showed her how to read the direction, the spacing that told of the deer's pace. Hannah found herself fascinated by this new way of seeing. What had looked like random marks now told a story. "There's more," Nanton said. He led her a few yards further, pointing out how the tracks wove between bushes. "Deer know the safe paths. Follow their wisdom." They tracked the deer's trail for a short distance before returning to their fence work. Hannah felt something shift in her understanding of the land. It wasn't just space to be claimed or worked. It was a living story, written in tracks and trails, in the way water flowed. And plants grew. The afternoon was waning when they finally headed back to the cabin. The smell of wood smoke and fish reached them before they rounded the last bend. They found Taza by the shed, tending to rows of fish suspended over a smoky fire. "Good catch today," he called out cheerfully. "River's starting to wake up." Hannah breathed in the rich aroma. "That smells wonderful." Taza grinned, adjusting a piece of wood in his fire. "Should be ready for Sunday." Speaking of which ... double quotes, he glanced at Nanton. "Word spread about the gathering. Think we'll have a good turnout?" Hannah looked between them questioningly. Nanton nodded slowly. "Time to invite neighbors," he explained. "Apache kin coming from upriver. Some white families too, the Hartleys, maybe others." His eyes held a determined light. "Show them we have nothing to hide. Let them see how we live." Hannah understood the significance. This wasn't just a social gathering, it was a statement. By opening their home to both communities, they were building bridges, challenging assumptions. "I'll need to bake," she said, already mentally listing what they'd need. Lots of baking. The next 2 days passed in a whirl of preparation. Hannah threw herself into cooking with purpose, determined to make the gathering special. She baked 4 pies, 2 apple, 2 berry, using dried fruit they'd traded for in town. Her hands seemed to remember every lesson her mother had taught her as she rolled out perfect crusts and mixed just the right amount of sugar and spice dot between pies. She baked batch after batch of biscuits, storing them carefully to stay fresh. The familiar work settled her nerves about the upcoming gathering. The kitchen filled with warm, sweet smells that drew both men in regularly to check on things. Taza kept the smokehouse fire going, tending his fish with equal care. Nanton split extra wood for the stove and cleared space in the cabin for visitors. They all felt the importance of the coming day. Sunday morning dawned bright and cold. Hannah woke early, plaiting her auburn hair into a neat braid. Before putting on her best dress, the dark blue calico she'd saved for special occasions. She'd washed and pressed it the day before, wanting everything to be just right. Standing before the small mirror Nanton had hung for her, Hannah barely recognized herself. The girl who'd stood alone on the church steps seemed like someone from a distant past. Her cheeks had more color now, her eyes brighter. Work and purpose had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She smoothed her skirts and went to help Taza set out the food. The first guest would arrive soon, and there was still much to do. But Hannah felt ready to stand beside Nanton and Taza, ready to help build something new in this place that had become her home. The Sunday morning sun sparkled off fresh snow, turning Nanton's yard into a sea of diamonds. Smoke rose straight and true from both the cabin chimney and the outdoor cooking fire where Taza tended his smoked fish. The cold air carried mingled scents of pine, coffee, and Hannah's fresh-baked pies. The first guests arrived just before noon, 3 Apache families from upriver, their children bundled in bright blankets. Hannah watched from the cabin door as Nanton greeted them with dignified gestures, speaking soft words in Apache that made the elders smile. The children quickly shed their blankets and began chasing each other through the snow, their laughter pure and bright against the winter quiet. Mrs. Hartley appeared next, driving her small wagon. She carried a basket covered with a red checked cloth, and her eyes widened appreciatively at the spread Hannah and Taza had laid out on the plank tables near the fire. "Brought my wild plum preserves," Mrs. Hartley announced, setting her basket down. "And some of that sourdough bread you liked last time, Nanton." Hannah helped her unpack while more guests arrived, 2 ranch hands from the Cooper spread. Then the blacksmith's family from Salt Creek. The yard filled with conversation, mixing English and Apache in a comfortable flow. Children darted between. Adult legs, snatching biscuits and bits of smoked fish. Near the fire, 3 Apache elders sat on logs, speaking in low tones with Nanton. Their weathered faces reflected firelight as they gestured toward the springs and the river beyond. Hannah caught fragments about water rights and sacred places as she moved among the guests with coffee. The gathering hit its stride as the sun reached its peak. Despite the cold, warmth seemed to radiate from the crowd itself. Even 2 men from town, Mr. Peterson from the Mercantile and young Tom Whitaker, had ridden out for the meal. They stood somewhat awkwardly at first, but soon relaxed as Taza shared stories about the best fishing spots along the river. Hannah's heart swelled as she watched the scene. This was what Nanton had hoped for: 2 communities sharing food and fellowship, children playing together without care for differences. She just set out her last pie when Nanton called for everyone's attention. He stood tall by the fire, his dark eyes reflecting both warmth and pride. "Today we share food and friendship," he began in clear English. "I want to introduce someone special." He gestured for Hannah to join him. Heat rose in her cheeks as she walked to his side, but she held her head high. "This is Hannah," Nanton sighed, then smiled. "But to us, she is Shash Tai-E Little Bear. Strong, brave, and part of our family." Hannah's eyes stung with sudden tears of joy. She hadn't known he'd given her an Apache name. The sound of it rolled through the gathering as the Apache guests nodded approvingly and repeated it. Shash Tai. Mrs. Hartley beamed at her from across the fire. Even the men from town looked impressed at this mark of acceptance. Hannah felt taller somehow, as if the name itself gave her new strength. The meal continued in high spirits. Hannah's pies disappeared quickly, with several guests asking for her recipe. She was explaining her mother's secret of adding a pinch of nutmeg, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the chatter. A well-dressed man on a sleek bay horse rode into the yard. His black coat and polished boots marked him as a city man, though he sat his horse with ease. The conversation died away as he dismounted, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth as creek ice. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Edwin Keating, agent for the Western Railroad Trust." Hannah saw Nanton's shoulders tighten, though his face remained calm. The Apache elders drew closer, together, watching. "You are welcome to share our meal," Nanton said formally, but Keating shook his head. "Most kind, but I'm here on business." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder. "These are official notifications regarding the railroad survey of this territory. I'm afraid the timeline has been moved up considerably." He handed Nanton several papers, their crisp edges stark against the informal gathering. "The survey crew will begin work in 3 weeks. By then, you'll need to provide proof of continuous family residence on this land as per territorial law." The words fell like stones into still water. Ripples of whispers spread through the guests. Hannah's stomach clenched tight as she watched. Nanton scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. 3 weeks? Mrs. Hartley spoke up, her voice sharp. "That's hardly reasonable time for anyone to gather such proof." Keating turned his practiced smile her way. "The railroad schedule waits for no one, ma'am. Progress, you understand." He returned his hat to his head with a slight bow. "Good day to you all." They watched him mount and ride away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the winter quiet. The gathering's warmth seemed to fade with him, replaced by an air of worry and consultation. The Apache elders huddled closer to Nanton, speaking rapidly in their language. The townsmen shifted uncomfortably, making excuses to leave. Hannah forced herself to keep smiling as she gathered empty plates, especially when the children looked her way. But her hands trembled slightly. 3 weeks. The railroad was trying to rush them to force a mistake. She looked at Nanton, still deep in discussion with the elders, and saw the weight settling onto his broad shoulders. The children continued their play, Oblivious to the adults' concern, their laughter a reminder of what was at stake. Hannah straightened her spine and carried on serving, passing out the last pieces of pie. She wouldn't let Keating's arrival poison this day entirely. Not when they'd come so far in bringing people together, but even as she maintained her cheerful demeanor, her mind raced. 3 weeks to prove what they all knew, that this was Nanton's home, his family's land. That the springs here were sacred to his people. That what they were building here mattered more than railroad schedules and progress. The sun was starting its descent when the guests began to leave, each departure marked by concerned looks and quiet promises of support. The children were the last to stop playing, called away reluctantly by their parents. Soon only Mrs. Hartley remained, helping Hannah clear away the remains of the meal. The first pale light of dawn crept through Hannah's window, accompanied by the steady thunk of an axe splitting wood. She pulled her shawl tight and moved to the window, watching Nanton's powerful swings. The morning frost turned his breath to silver clouds as he worked, his movements precise and purposeful. Inside the cabin, Hannah stirred the banked coals in the stove and added kindling. Her fingers moved through the familiar routine of making breakfast while her mind churned with worries about the railroad's deadline. 3 weeks seemed impossibly short when Nanton came in, bringing a blast of cold air and an armload of split wood. Hannah had hot coffee and cornmeal mush waiting. Steam rose from their cups as they sat at the small table. Taza had left the previous evening to spread word among their kin about the railroad's ultimatum. "We must prepare proof," Nanton sighed, his deep voice quiet but firm. "Show this is a true home, not just a cabin." He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and smoothed it on the table. "Need witness statements from neighbors. Supply records from town. Signs of family life that any agent can see." Hannah nodded, studying his careful list. "The window. Boxes," she said. "We could start early greens there, show we're planning for spring." "Good thinking." His dark eyes held approval. "Every detail matters now." They worked without rest as the sun climbed higher. Hannah scrubbed the cabin's worn floorboards until they gleamed, then arranged her mending basket prominently by the window. Nanton repaired loose shingles on the roof while she planted mustard and radish seeds in the window boxes he'd built last fall. "Keep smoke rising," Nanton reminded her as he headed out to mend fences. "Shows life here, even from far off." Hannah tended the stove carefully, adding small pieces of green wood when needed to maintain a steady curl of smoke above the chimney. Her hands stayed busy with domestic tasks while her mind raced through ways to prove this was a real household. She hung fresh curtains, arranged her few books on a shelf, placed a quilt she was working on over the back of a chair. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Hannah looked up from sorting dried beans to see Mrs. Hartley's wagon approaching. The older woman's face was drawn with concern as she climbed down. "Child," she said as Hannah met her at the door, "I had to come warn you. There's ugly talk in town." Hannah's stomach tightened, but she made herself ask, "What kind of talk?" Mrs. Hartley's weathered hands twisted her shawl. "Some folks are saying, well, they're suggesting you're earning your keep here in dishonorable ways." She spat the words out like they tasted bitter. "Your aunt's beside herself, claiming you've brought shame to the family name." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She'd known there would be gossip, but this... She steadied herself against the doorframe, fighting waves of nausea. "I'll set them straight," Mrs. Hartley continued fiercely. "I've seen how things are here. You're doing honest work, living clean and proper." "Thank you," Hannah managed, though her voice shook slightly. "Would you would you put that in writing? For the railroad's proof?" "Already thought of that." Mrs. Hartley patted her pocket, brought paper and ink. "I'll write out every detail of what I've seen here. The cooking, the cleaning, the way you help with chores. Proper work for proper pay, just like any hired girl." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Nanton stood there, his face dark with understanding. He must have heard enough to grasp the situation. "Come inside," he said quietly, "both of you." In the warmth of the cabin, Mrs. Hartley sat at the table and wrote steadily, her pen scratching against the paper. Hannah moved automatically to make fresh coffee, grateful for the familiar task. "They spit on what they don't understand," Nanton said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. A truth will stand, even if they spit on it. You? Do honest work here, Hannah. Hold to that. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Hartley finished writing and signed the paper with a flourish. There, she said firmly, first witness statement ready. And I'll talk to others who've been here, seen how things are. The Coopers, the Petersons, decent folks who know the difference between truth and gossip. After Mrs. Hartley left, Hannah sat by the stove with her mending basket, forcing her hands to stay steady as she worked on one of Nanton's shirts. The familiar rhythm of needle and thread helped calm her racing thoughts. She wouldn't let them see her cry. Wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Nanton moved quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the stove, checking the window boxes. His presence was solid, reassuring. Finally, he spoke. My mother faced such talk, he said softly, when she taught English to our people. Some said she betrayed our ways. Others said worse things. But she held to what was right. He paused, looking at Hannah with quiet intensity. As you do now. Hannah's throat tightened, but she kept sewing, each stitch a small act of defiance against those who would shame her. Outside, the winter sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. Inside, the stove's warmth wrapped around them like a blanket as they continued their work in companionable silence, preparing for the battles ahead. The shirt slowly took shape under Hannah's careful stitches. Each repair felt like a statement. I belong here. I do honest work. I will not be shamed away from what is right. 2 days after Mrs. Hartley's visit, the winter morning dawned gray and threatening snow. Hannah stood at the cabin's window, kneading bread dough while watching dark clouds gather over the distant hills. The peaceful rhythm of her work shattered as 3 horses thundered into the yard, carrying 2 deputies and the sharply dressed Mr. Keating. Nanton stepped out onto the porch, his stance calm but alert. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and moved to join him, her heart pounding against her ribs. Nanton Lobo, the older deputy called out, his hand resting too casually near his gun belt. We've had reports you're harboring a white girl against her will. Mr. Keating sat straight in his saddle, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Just doing our duty to protect vulnerable citizens, he added smoothly. Hannah stepped forward, anger burning in her chest. I'm here by my own choice, she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Nobody's keeping me against my will. The younger deputy dismounted, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us. For your own protection, you understand. His tone suggested he understood nothing at all. This is ridiculous, Hannah protested, but Nanton touched her arm gently. We will go, he said quietly. Show them truth with calm. The ride into Salt Creek stretched long and miserable. Hannah sat rigid in the deputy's saddle, refusing to look at the curious faces that appeared in windows as they passed. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept her chin high. Behind her, she heard the steady hoofbeats of Nanton's horse under guard. The jail stood at the edge of town, a squat building of rough stone. Inside, the air hung heavy with dampness and old fear. The older deputy led Hannah to a cell, while they put Nanton in another across the narrow corridor. The iron doors clanged shut with terrible finality. Hearing will be tomorrow morning, the deputy announced. Judge Thompson's writing in special. He smirked at Nanton. Might want to pray. Your white friend here stays loyal in front of him. Hannah gripped the cold bars, fighting down waves of nausea as the deputy's bootsteps retreated. The cell felt impossibly small, with only a narrow bench and a thin blanket for comfort. Outside the high window, she could see heavy clouds promising snow. Hannah. Nanton's voice came soft but clear across the corridor. Are you well? Yes, she managed, though her voice shook slightly. I'm so sorry about this. No sorry needed. You did nothing wrong. There was a quiet strength in his words that helped steady her. Tomorrow we speak truth. Simple, clear. No anger. Hannah sank onto the hard bench, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. They'll twist everything, she said bitterly. Make it sound shameful. Let them twist, Nanton replied. Truth stands straight. The afternoon dragged into evening. Deputies brought bread and thin soup, along with poorly hidden sneers. Hannah heard them talking in the front office, their voices carrying through. The old walls. Apache thinks he's clever, one said with a harsh laugh. Getting himself a white woman to claim his land. Won't last, another responded. These white girls, they talk brave till the judge frowns at them. Then they remember their place right quick. Hannah's hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream at them about honor and dignity and the quiet strength she'd found in Nanton's home. Instead, she forced herself to breathe slowly, remembering his counsel for calm. Night crept in, bringing bitter cold that seeped through the stone walls. Hannah huddled under the thin blanket, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard bench. Across the corridor, she could hear Nanton's steady breathing. "Cannot sleep?" he asked softly after a while. "No," she admitted. "Keep thinking about tomorrow." "Tell me about your mother's hymns," he said. "The ones you hum while working." Hannah smiled slightly in the darkness, understanding what he offered. Distraction, comfort, connection. She began speaking quietly about her mother's favorite songs, the ones that had filled their little house with hope even in hard times. "She always said music was God's way of helping us breathe when fear sits too heavy," Hannah whispered. "I didn't understand then." "Your mother was wise," Nanton replied. "Fear is like winter wind. Must breathe through it, not fight it." A deputy's sharp rap on the bars interrupted them. "Less talking in there," he ordered. "Some of us are trying to work." Hannah pulled the blanket tighter, listening to the wind rising outside. In the quiet dark, she began to pray, first in whispers and then in her heart. She prayed for courage, for clarity, for the strength to stand firm when morning came. She prayed for Nanton, for his land, for the sacred springs that gave life to the river. The night grew deeper. Occasional bursts of laughter from the deputy's card game cut through the silence, along with cruel jokes about Indian lovers and squaw men. Each barb stoked the anger in Hannah's chest, but she held to Nanton's wisdom about staying calm. "Sleep if you can," Nanton said eventually, his voice barely carrying across the space between them. "Tomorrow needs clear eyes." Hannah curled onto her side, the rough blanket doing little against the cold. Despite her racing thoughts, exhaustion gradually pulled her toward uneasy sleep. Her last conscious thought was of the cabin, of the bread dough she'd left rising, of the home she'd found in its quiet strength. Whatever came tomorrow, she would not let them shame that truth away. Through the high window, snow began to fall, each flake catching the dim lamplight before disappearing into the darkness. In the cells, two people who had found unexpected family waited for dawn, their breath rising like prayers in the cold air. Morning light crept through the high jail window, painting thin bars of gold across the damp stone floor. Hannah sat up, stiffly on the hard bench, her muscles protesting from the cold night. Across the corridor, Nanton already stood at his cell bars, watching the deputies change shifts with careful attention. The new deputy brought them cornmeal mush and coffee that was more grounds than brew. Hannah forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need strength for whatever the day might bring. The morning crawled by slowly, marked only by bootsteps and murmured conversations from the office. Just before noon, familiar footsteps clicked down the corridor. Hannah's heart sank as her aunt, Mrs. Webb, appeared before her cell, clutching her reticule with white-knuckled hands. "Oh, Hannah," Mrs. Webb breathed, her face pinched with concern. "What have you done to yourself?" Hannah stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirt as best she could. "I haven't done anything wrong, Aunt Sarah. You're in jail, child." Her aunt's voice rose sharply. "Living with an Indian, letting the whole town talk about your shame. Your poor mother would be heartbroken." The mention of her mother stung, but Hannah lifted her chin. "Mama taught me to judge people by their actions, not their race. Nanton has shown me nothing but respect and kindness." Mrs. Webb glanced nervously toward Nanton's cell, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "Come home with me now, before it's too late. We can tell everyone you were confused, maybe even frightened into staying there. No one need know." "No." Hannah's voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "I won't lie to save face. I'm exactly where I choose to be. You're throwing away any chance of a proper life." Her aunt's eyes filled with tears. "No decent man will have you after this scandal." Hannah stepped closer to the bars, meeting her aunt's gaze steadily. "I won't abandon what's right just because it's difficult. You taught me that too, remember?" Mrs. Webb drew back as if struck. She opened her mouth to argue further, but quick footsteps interrupted as the younger deputy appeared. "Judge Thompson's here," he announced. Says he can't hear the case proper until next week, but he'll set bond today. Relief and anxiety warred in Hannah's chest. A week's delay meant more time to prepare, but also more time for rumors to spread. She watched as Taza arrived, speaking quietly with the judge about vouching for both their appearances in court. Deputies opened their cells with obvious reluctance. Hannah's legs trembled slightly as she stepped out, stiff from the cold night. Nathan emerged with quiet dignity, nodding thanks to his cousin. Outside, the winter sun felt almost warm after the jail's dampness. Their horses waited, brought by Taza from the cabin. Hannah mounted carefully, very aware of the townspeople watching from windows and doorways. No one spoke as their small group rode out of Salt Creek. The familiar trail home seemed longer than usual. Hannah found herself stealing glances at Nathan, trying to read his thoughts in his profile. He rode straight-backed as always, but she noticed tension in the set of his jaw. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the yard when they finally reached the cabin. Hannah dismounted, her body aching from tension and poor sleep. Inside, everything looked exactly as she'd left it, the half-kneaded bread dough, her shawl draped over a chair, Nathan's book stacked neatly by the stove. The sight brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She busied herself making supper, finding comfort in the routine of measuring beans and cornmeal. Nathan and Taza spoke quietly in Apache on the porch, their voices a familiar murmur through the walls. By the time the food was ready, darkness had fallen. They ate in companionable silence until Nathan set down his spoon. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for speaking truth to the deputies, for not letting fear win." Hannah looked up from her bowl, meeting his dark eyes across the table. "I won't let them take what's yours," she said simply. The words carried more weight than she'd intended, heavy with all the things they hadn't said about family and belonging and trust. Something softened in Nathan's expression, but he said nothing more. Outside, an owl called into the gathering. Night. Hannah finished her supper, aware of the week stretching ahead like an uncharted trail. Whatever came next, she knew she'd chosen her path. No amount of jail cells or disapproving aunts could make her step off it now. The week before the hearing stretched out like a taut wire. Every morning, Hannah woke with the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. She threw herself into proving their household was real and proper, scrubbing floors until they gleamed and hanging fresh curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks. Nathan spent long hours in the saddle, writing to visit neighbors who might speak for them. The winter wind had softened slightly, but still bit through clothes and chilled bones. Each evening when he returned, his face told a story before he spoke. Some doors had closed before he could knock, while others opened cautiously. Misses. Sarah Hartley proved to be their strongest ally. She arrived one morning with her own mule cart, bringing fresh eggs and determination. "Land's land," she declared, settling at their table with a cup of coffee. "And any fool can see you're caring for it proper." She spent an hour carefully writing out her statement, describing how she'd traded with Nathan for years and seen nothing but honorable dealings. 2 other neighbors, the Petersons, who ran sheep in the next valley, added their signatures to papers, testifying that Nathan's cabin had been a proper household since before Christmas. Hannah's hand shook slightly as she served them coffee. Touched by their willingness to stand against town opinion, Taza rode out early one morning, frost still crackling under his horse's hooves, bound for the Indian Agency office. He returned 2 days later with official copies of Nathan's land papers, showing his right to the springs and surrounding acres. "The clerk remembered your mother," Taza told Nathan over supper. "Said she was the first Apache woman he knew who could read every word on a deed." Hannah watched Nathan's face soften at the mention of his mother. He traced the paper's edges with careful fingers, as if touching a precious memory. The evening wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows. Hannah had just finished washing the supper dishes when Nathan approached, something folded in his hand. His expression was serious, almost uncertain, a look she'd never seen before. "There is something you should know," he said quietly, holding out what appeared to be an official document. From the Sunday gathering 2 weeks past. Hannah dried her hands on her apron and took the paper. As she unfolded it, her heart seemed to stop. There, in clear black ink, was a marriage certificate. Her name, Nathan's name, the preacher's signature, the date of their gathering, her voice caught. "You married me without telling me?" Nanton's dark eyes held hers steadily. "I told. You in my way," he said softly. "When I gave you my mother's blanket. When I named you Shashtai before my people. When I trusted you with my home." Hannah sank into a chair, the paper trembling in her hands. She remembered each moment he mentioned, the wool blanket draped around her shoulders that first cold day, the pride she'd felt hearing her Apache name, the quiet ways he'd made space for her in his life. "The preacher understood," Nanton continued, his voice gentle. "He saw what was growing between us. When I asked him to file it quietly, he agreed, for your protection. So no one could say you were here wrongly." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, not of anger but of understanding. All this time, he'd been sheltering her reputation as carefully as he protected his land. She thought of her aunt's accusations, the town's whispers, the deputy's sneers, and how none of it had touched her here in this home that was already hers. "My mother taught me," Nanton said, settling in the chair beside her, "that true marriage is built day by day like a strong cabin. Papers are just the roof it keeps the rain off." Hannah traced their names on the certificate, remembering how he'd introduced her to everyone that Sunday, how the children had danced around them, how the elders had nodded in approval. He had indeed told her in his way, she simply hadn't known how to hear it yet. Carefully, she folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket, close to her heart. Outside, the wind's howl softened to a whisper. The lamp's flame cast their shadows on the wall, merged into one shape. "The hearing is in 3 days," Nanton said after a while. "This paper may help, or it may make some people angrier. Are you ready for that?" Hannah thought of her aunt's tears in the jail, of the turned backs in town, of the life she might have had if she'd stayed within the lines others drew for her. Then she thought of this home, built on trust and quiet care, where she'd found strength she never knew she had. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Let them be angry. We know what's true." Nanton's hand found hers in the lamplight, warm and calloused. They sat together as the evening deepened, listening to the wind sing through the cottonwoods by the river. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment, everything that needed saying had been said at last. The morning of the hearing arrived, beneath a slate-gray sky that promised snow. Hannah stood before the small mirror in Nanton's cabin, pinning her auburn hair with trembling fingers. She wore her best dress, freshly pressed, though its hem showed wear, and the wool blanket Nanton had first given her draped across her shoulders against the biting cold. Biting cold. Outside, frost crackled under their boots as they made their way to the wagon. Taza had hitched up the team before dawn, spreading fresh straw in the bed to ward off the chill. The three rode in silence through the hushed winter landscape, there, breath-forming white clouds in the frigid air. Salt Creek's courthouse, little more than a large meeting room above the marshal's office, already bustled with activity when they arrived. Hannah's heart thundered against her ribs as she climbed down from the wagon, Nanton's steady hand at her elbow. The marriage certificate lay folded in her pocket, pressed against her hip like a secret weapon. Townsfolk filed up the narrow stairs, their boots echoing on wooden treads. Some nodded cautiously to Hannah, others turned away. She caught glimpses of familiar faces, Mr. Graves from the Mercantile, Mrs. Hartley sitting straight back near the front, and her aunt, Mrs. Webb, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Near the back, the room filled quickly. Railroad men in dark suits clustered near the front, their polished boots and clean collars standing out among the working clothes of ranchers and traders. Several Apache elders entered with quiet dignity, taking seats along the wall. The air grew thick with the smell of wool coats and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Judge Harrison entered, his gray beard neatly trimmed, reading glasses perched on his nose. The room rose, then settled as he took his seat behind the broad desk. Hannah noticed how his eyes lingered on Nanton, then swept across to where she sat. Mr. Edwin Keating rose first, his manner smooth as cream. He opened a leather portfolio and began laying out the railroad's case with practiced ease. His words painted pictures of progress, steam engines bringing civilization, commerce flowing like water across the territory. His voice held a note of inevitability as he spoke of the greater good, of how one man's springs were small price to pay for such advancement. The land in question, Keating said, gesturing to a map he'd unrolled, sits at a critical juncture for our planned route. The springs there would supply our water stations, vital for steam operations. He paused, straightening his vest. While we sympathize with Mr. Lobo's attachment to the property, we must consider the broader benefits to the territory. Hannah watched Nathan's face remain impassive, though she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. She knew what Keating couldn't see, the sacred nature of those springs, the generations of his family who had protected them, the quiet power of that place that had nothing to do with steam engines or progress. When Keating mentioned questionable household arrangements and proper family occupancy requirements, Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. She heard her aunt's soft sob from the back of the room, the moment stretched taut as a fiddle string. Hannah's hand pressed against her pocket, feeling the paper within. Before Nathan could rise to speak, she stood, her heart pounding but her voice clear. "Your Honor," she said, forcing herself to look straight at Judge Harrison, "I need to speak." The judge peered at her over his spectacles, then nodded once. "Proceed, Miss Cole." "Mrs. Lobo," she corrected, drawing the marriage certificate from her pocket. Several gasps punctuated the sudden silence. "I am Nathan Lobo's lawful wife, married at the gathering 2 weeks past with Reverend Stevens officiating." She walked forward, unfolding the document with careful fingers, and presented it to the judge. Her legs felt wooden, but her spine remained straight. She could feel every eye in the room boring into her back. Judge Harrison studied the certificate, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched until Hannah could hear the wind whistling through a crack in the window frame. Finally, he looked up, first at Hannah, then at Nathan. "This appears to be in order," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Properly witnessed and filed." He turned his attention to Mr. Keating. "The household occupancy requirement specified in the land grant has been met. A married couple maintaining a home on the property fulfills all legal conditions." Keating's smooth facade cracked slightly. "Your Honor, surely the circumstances are not the court's concern," Judge Harrison cut in firmly. "The law requires proof of continuous household occupancy. That proof has been provided." He shuffled his papers decisively. "The railroad's petition for mandatory sale is denied. This land remains the legal property of Mr. Nathan Lobo and his wife." The tension that had held Hannah rigid suddenly released. She swayed slightly, steadying herself against the wooden rail. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Hartley's quiet "Thank the Lord" amid the rising murmur of voices. As people began filing out, Hannah turned to find Nathan watching her. The gratitude in his dark eyes spoke more than words could say. She noticed his shoulders had finally relaxed, though his hand still gripped the back of his chair tightly. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, dancing past the courthouse windows. Hannah stood at Nathan's side as Taza brought the wagon around, watching the white flakes dust the shoulders of departing townspeople. Mr. Keating strode past without a glance, his boots clicking sharply on the wooden sidewalk. The snow fell harder. As they prepared to leave, transforming the dusty street into something clean and new, Hannah felt Nathan's hand slip into hers as they walked to the wagon, warm despite the cold. Above them, the gray sky continued to scatter snowflakes like stars falling to earth, each one carrying the promise of tomorrow. The ice on the San Juan River cracked and groaned in the warming March sun. Hannah watched from the doorway of their cabin as great sheets of it broke free, revealing the dark water beneath. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder, marking winter's retreat. Nathan stood beside her, his eyes following the flow of water from their sacred springs down to where it joined the river. "Time to prepare the earth," he said simply, reaching for his shovel. They worked through the morning, side by side, their boots sinking into the softening soil. Hannah's muscles ached from channeling the spring water into neat furrows, but pride bloomed in her chest at each completed row. The water trickled down like silver threads, promising life to seeds not yet planted. Laughter rang out as children darted between the planting beds, some from the reservation, others from nearby ranches. Their small feet left prints in the damp earth as they chased each other, paying no mind to the boundaries adults drew between their worlds. Mrs. Hartley's wagon rattled up the path. loaded with seed packets and early seedlings. My contribution. To your garden, she announced warmly, helping Hannah sort through varieties of beans and squash. Later, a ranch hand delivered a surprise, an apple pie from Hannah's aunt, the gesture speaking louder than words. As the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink, Hannah and Nanton stood at the edge of their fields. The spring water whispered through the furrows with a sound like music, reminding Hannah of the hymns her mother once sang. Nanton took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. In Apache, he spoke words she had come to understand. You were never too much. You were always enough. Hannah squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. The water song flowed around them like a blessing, marking the beginning of their first spring together. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.